Hello, class. Today, my topic is Park Chung-Hee and why isn't he infamous worldwide? So, today we're going to look at historical context analysis of Park Chung-Hee and comparisons of him to other world leaders. We're looking at these things in particular because it'll help us understand where Korea stood in areas such as economics and society, as well as considering how other nations at the time saw Korea, therefore seeing the diplomacy of Korea before and during Park Chung-hee's rule. Being well known has a lot to do with perceptions, therefore, understanding what information would have gotten out of Korea or would have even been interesting to world leaders or citizens is an important thing to reflect on in trying to answer why someone as influential as Park Chung-hee wouldn't have been well known outside of Korea. Looking at contemporary Korea, starting in the 1940s, Korea was recognized as its own nation. However, in 1945, Korea had a recently suppressed culture and whose land and people were used for economic gain by imperialistic Japan. Because Korea was newly out of the grasp of Imperial Japan and the ideological Cold War was beginning, important world leaders met about Korea behind closed doors without any Korean authorities. It was decided at the Moscow Conference that the US and USSR would be in charge of building up Korea. However, the lines that were built ideologically between the two superpowers became superimposed and ended up creating permanent boundaries. The Korean War began in 1950 and ended in 1953, but without any true peace treaty. Therefore, there are still tensions and unfulfilled expectations for reunification. We're looking at historical context to consider the major events that could have taken attention away from the amazing growth in Korea, because inner turmoil in a country typically causes a more inward-focused society. The US was the main superpower and had become hyper-focused on an ideological war against the USSR for a time. True peace between the two nations wouldn't come until Gorbachev's era in Russia. Additionally, the US was going through changes internally with a focus on civil rights. Both the USSR and US were developing technology and attempting to get to space first. When Park Chung-hee was coming into power in 1961, the nation was economically behind leading nations by a fair margin. American households could be having TV dinners that were prepared in a microwave, while Korea was economically at its record low at 2 USD billion GDP in comparison to the US, which was recorded of having a GDP of 543 USD billion. Park Chung-hee grew up a part of a family of 7 and was the youngest. Because of growing up in poverty, he said himself that poverty was his teacher. Park Chung-hee repetitively had shown admiration for strength and power above anything else. He grew up to adopt his father's views of Japan as a great nation and saw the Joseon dynasty as being at fault for being weak enough to be taken over. Park Chung-hee desperately wanted to attend a military school in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, and upon being refused the first time, he wrote his second application in blood to show his loyalty to the Japanese government. After being accepted, the former president graduated with honors, attended a military school in Tokyo, and studied the Meiji Restoration movement of Japan. His time in the Japanese military schools was his first time truly thriving in schools and rising in ranks, but afterwards it became somewhat of a norm for him. Even after almost being executed for being part of a communist Korean Workers' Party, his superiors saw his potential and he was saved. Eventually, then, he was able to rise to the rank of general following his reinstatement during the Korean War. Following his coup of the government, Park Chung-hee had the country under martial law and restricted political activity until the U.S. forced elections in 1963, in which he won. Under the government, the Economic Planning Board was created, as well as the KCIA and Democratic Republican Party. The economic reforms set in place worked, and the economy was booming by the 1960s. In 1971, Park Chung-hee got rid of the constitution that was in place and set up his new republic under the Yushin Constitution. We're going to be looking at his successes under the sectors of government, social development, economics, and human rights. In government, he succeeded in ruling with a clear direction. In the 1963 election, he was actually voted into office because economic growth was his main goal, and he accomplished it. In social development, there was a mass movement towards urban areas. In economics, from the 1960s until the 1970s, under the 5-year plans, Korea had one of the fastest growing economies. In human rights, it was the first time Korea had truly had a norm for children to be educated. Korea was then able to have human capital and universal primary education failures. In government, the government was largely a puppet government under Park Chung-hee, with leaders being his friends, and eventually he made himself an authoritative ruler. In social development, he supported monopolies, making creating new businesses difficult, and he created exclusivity in the labor field. In human rights, Park Chung-hee often used force in order to maintain control, and in economics, the fast development led to a buildup of foreign debt and inflation, which later presidents would then have to deal with afterwards. For our analysis in the economy, Park Chung-Hee's accomplishment in his work with the Korean economy is what, in my opinion, would be most likely to spread Park Chung-Hee's name. His 5-year plans were hard-driven and successful. However, the growth that the 5-year plans brought were mostly catching up to the economic standings of other nations. Companies like Samsung that rose to be superpowers in their respective fields got to where they are because of Park Chung-Hee's initiatives, but in the 1990s, which was after his assassination. Additionally, the reforms that Park Chung-hee had in the beginning of his time in office were very similar to those of the Meiji Restoration. Therefore, while his methods were genius and it worked, it wasn't the first time the world had seen something similar. In diplomacy, the government Park Chung-hee took control of was reliant on foreign aid and wasn't taken seriously by foreign nations. No Korean government was represented at any conference following the World Wars or even the Korean War. This helps account for the fact that Park Chung-hee wouldn't have been a well-known name because other countries seemed to have overlooked the country he ran for many years. One of the only times that it seems that a foreign government took notice and action pertaining to Park Chung-hee was in his 1963 election, after which he took over in an authoritarian way. And then in society, while inside of Korea itself, there was a massive growth during 1961 and 1969 in society through its infrastructure, industry, education, and urbanization. The country itself was considered backward beforehand. The growth of South Korea did not entertain America or other developed nations as much because they didn't think they had anything to learn from Korea's progress. This isn't to say that their feats went unnoticed. Other nations did learn from Korea, such as Bolivia, Vietnam, Uganda, Laos, and Rwanda, who took principles from the Samao movement to implement into their own countries. The world leaders we're going to compare to Park Chung-hee are Napoleon Bonaparte and FDR. So in his youth, Park Chung-hee was actually known to have adored Napoleon and seen him as an inspiration. Some inspirations we could assume Park Chung-hee took from Napoleon could be, is that he made educational reforms a priority in helping Korea develop. Another similarity between the two leaders was that they both led coups to take over their respective governments, and they both had a core group of supporters that helped them take more power. They both knew that running the government how they wanted, they would need people in their pocket. Both of their governments started at least imitating a republic with checks on power until they finally changed the constitutions to give themselves full power. Some key differences between the two men, however, was that Napoleon focused on expansion, while Park Chung-hee himself was focused more on internal order. Also, Napoleon took power in 1799, a time in which France was already a global superpower because of its colonization. FDR led the U.S. through World War II and the Great Depression. Things that were better than FDR's initiatives, like the Civilian Civil Corps, was that the government directly gave jobs to impoverishment. However, in the Samao movement, only materials were given out, and it was up to the communities themselves to ensure growth. This put the government in substantially less debt and led to development. For our conclusions, the superpowers of the globe were in an ideological battle that was progressing to levels that could wipe out entire countries. South Korea's civil war was used by the superpowers to further their own agendas, belittling the country in the eyes of international citizens. Additionally, Park Chung-hee followed the example of his predecessors in following the U.S.'s wishes. Therefore, the U.S. wasn't overly concerned about the country's leader. One particular example of this was when he held an election when the U.S. demanded he did so. When you compare other world leaders to Park Chung-hee, their countries were already superpowers. Additionally, Park Chung-hee was a well-spoken and convincing speaker that demanded respect. However, in early years, he was very secretive. His political affiliations were largely unknown at the beginning of his career, and there were many questions surrounding his ambitions or choices. He could have been a part of an attempted communist coup or not. No one really knows how he ended up being admitted to the Japanese military school, and it's even unclear what exactly brought about his assassination. Finally, his initiatives were incredibly impactful. It's easy to say that Park Chung-hee was a wise man. However, some of his wiseness came from learning from other leaders' examples or knowing what had worked in the past and what hadn't. The growth in Korea due to Park Chung-hee's rule is incredible to see. However, considering the context of the world events, it's easier to understand why his impact didn't grab as much attention worldwide. Thank you for listening.